On a normal June morning, the waters underneath the Sunshine Skyway Bridge in Tampa, Florida are a peaceful, tranquil sight. However, on June 14, 1989, that tranquil image was shattered in the most horrific of ways. A sailboat containing several friends was making its way back to Florida after a vacation in Key West. While passing under the bridge, the passengers spotted an object floating in the water that looked strange. Curious, they approached it where, to their horror, they found the body of a young woman floating in the water. She was bound with rope and nude from the waist down with a large concrete block tied around her neck to weigh her down. Police arrived on scene, but not long after they'd retrieved her from the water, a call came in of another woman found in the exact same condition just a few miles north of where the first body was found. Stunningly, as a police boat was in the middle of retrieving that body, a call came in that a third woman had also been found, bound by rope, nude from the waist down, and with a concrete block tied around her neck, just like the other two had been. Police now had 3 dead women on their hands, but were faced with challenges in identifying their victims due to the fact they had suffered heavy decomposition in their time underwater. All 3 had also been sexually assaulted and were still alive when they were thrown into the murky waters of Tampa Bay. None of the victims had a driver's license or any other identification on them save for a little bit of jewelry. So for the first week after the bodies were discovered, police were just kinda left chasing their tails. However, that would soon change. Hal Rogers is a dairy farmer from the small town of Wilshire, Ohio, a town which at the time had a population of about 500 that has since shrunk to just over 400. Hal lived on his family's farm with his wife Joan and their 2 daughters, Michelle and Christy. To say the family lived a sheltered life would be putting it mildly. Throughout the entirety of their marriage, Joan and Hal had never so much as left their small town for a family trip. Though they had discussed it several times, the rigorous life of owning and maintaining a dairy farm didn't allow them to indulge in such a fantasy. However, 1988 proved to be an extremely difficult year for the family. John Rogers was Hal's brother and business partner. He owned 50% of the family farm and lived in a trailer just off the main house. In March of 1988, John was arrested for sexually assaulting his ex-girlfriend who was living with him in his trailer at the time of the incident. During this assault, he'd taken pictures of his victim, which he kept in a suitcase in his bedroom as something of a memento. When police arrested him and searched his trailer, they discovered this suitcase and the contents inside of it, which, in addition to the pictures of John's ex-girlfriend, contained photos of Michelle being sexually assaulted by her uncle. Hal and Joan were in complete and utter shock. They went home and confronted their daughter, asking her point blank if she'd been attacked, where she broke down and confessed that he had been sexually abusing her for years and that he'd done so right under her parents' noses. For obvious reasons, this whole series of events had caused the rest of the year and the early parts of 1989 to be an incredibly stressful time for the Rogers family. Joan decided now was the time to finally pull the trigger on that family trip she and her husband had planned for so long. After talking with her daughters and some friends, Joan settled on making their destination Florida, specifically Orlando and its collection of famous theme parks, with Disney World being the destination they wanted to see the most. Originally, this was supposed to be a full family trip, but Hal decided that he'd be better off staying behind and looking after the day-to-day of the farm. The family trip had now become girls only, with Joan leaving her home state for the first time in hopes that she and her daughters could just relax and get their minds off of everything. A sweet, tender dream that tragically would turn into an unimaginable nightmare. Joan and the girls left for their trip, taking the most scenic drive they could from Ohio to Orlando as to allow the experience to marinate. Remember, for all 3, this was literally the first time they had ever left Ohio. During the first few days, Joan made a very concerted effort to keep in contact with Hal and inform him what the trio was up to. However, for the last couple of days, he hadn't heard from his wife or daughters at all. In fact, the last message of any kind he received from them was a postcard which arrived on the 29th of May. Initially, he tried to keep calm and just reasoned that they were unable to get a phone or some other issue which had prevented them from contacting him. When they failed to return home the day they were supposed to, though, Hal became incredibly worried. He reported them missing to local police, then went and withdrew thousands of dollars from his bank account so he could rent a plane and fly himself to Florida in order to look for his family. He wouldn't need to bother with all of that, though, as hundreds of miles away at a Days Inn hotel in Tampa, the fate of his wife and daughters was already being discovered. A maid working at the hotel noticed one specific room that had gone entirely untouched for several days. The room was rented by a woman with her 2 girls, but they were never seen again after the night of their check-in. It was now going on a week with no sign of the occupants, and inside the beds hadn't been slept in, the bathrooms hadn't been used, and the entire room seemed to just be untouched. The maid voiced her concerns to her bosses, who agreed to contact police. Arriving on scene, investigators discovered luggage and several other belongings, which they quickly realized belonged to the Rogers family. A camera on their dresser contained a roll of film, with the last couple pictures being from the day the 3 women checked into the hotel. These last photos were a picture of a sunburnt Michelle sitting on the hotel room floor going through her suitcase, and a shot outside of the window of the Tampa sunset, which was taken the night of May 29th. Police had a hunch this room might belong to the 3 women whose bodies they'd found in the bay a couple days prior, and subsequent fingerprint tests would eventually confirm that, indeed, the 3 victims were Joan, Michelle, and Christine Rogers. Somehow, on the final leg of their trip, a trip which was meant to relieve them of the enormous pain of the last year's events, all 3 women had become victims of one of the most brutal crimes imaginable, and then were thrown into the cold waters of Tampa Bay while they were still alive. Hal Rogers was contacted that afternoon and informed that his wife and both of his daughters were now dead. The small town of Wilshire, which had already endured so much, was shaken to its core. Who could possibly do something so heinous to a mother and her 2 girls? Hal was left an utterly broken man, blaming himself for not being there to protect his family. No one who knew the victims could possibly imagine who'd have done such a thing. Indeed, police were wrestling with these same questions. Hal was the first person they looked at, which will come as no surprise to anyone familiar with these types of cases. However, since he was several states away and had spent the entire week his family was gone working on his farm, he had a ton of alibis, and police ruled him out as a suspect fairly quickly. Physical evidence was few and far between. The photographs from the hotel room helped establish a timeline of events, revealing that the 3 of them had spent the last several days just enjoying the famous theme parks of Orlando. Based on what they were told by Hal and the hotel staff, police theorized that after they left Orlando, Joan decided to extend the vacation one more day rather than head back to Ohio immediately. Detectives believe this was because she got lost driving out of Orlando, but we can't be 100% sure. What we do know is for whatever reason they stopped in Tampa and decided to get a hotel room there. They were last seen by staff the night of their check-in having dinner at the hotel's restaurant. Joan's car, a 1984 Oldsmobile Calais, could not be located in the Days Inn parking lot. The vehicle was found later that afternoon at a boat dock off the Courtney Campbell Causeway. This was a public dock, so anyone could have brought their boat here and there was no way to track who'd come and gone. What did seem clear to investigators, though, was someone had lured the 3 women here and onto a boat before tossing them overboard. A possible clue was found inside Joan's Oldsmobile, a small piece of scrap paper which contained handwritten directions to this specific dock, directions that police determined had not been written by any of the 3 victims, making it very likely the person who wrote these directions had something to do with the murders. They also found a handwritten note by Joan, which they theorized was a description of the boat they had gotten onto. Despite what may seem like a promising start, there wasn't much other evidence to go off of. Owning a boat in Florida isn't exactly rare, particularly in Tampa. And while the handwriting sample was nice, if police couldn't find a suspect to compare it with, then it was functionally useless. The murders, of course, horrified the local community, resulting in hundreds of tips pouring in to police. So many that the sheer volume of leads they had to track down and rule out started to grind the investigation to a snail's pace. One by one, all these leads seemed to go nowhere, except for one. A Canadian tourist named Judy Blair told police that 2 weeks before the Rogers murder, she was sexually assaulted by a man she'd been hanging out with throughout her trip to Florida. She said herself and the friend she was traveling with originally met a man who only identified himself as Dave at a local convenience store. After going out and having drinks with him later that night, he told the two women he was a local contractor who worked with aluminum siding and that he owned a boat which he used to take tourists out on trips. He offered to take both of them out on one such trip the following evening. After discussing it back at their hotel that night, Judy decided she wanted to go while her friend declined. When she arrived at the dock and told Dave it was just going to be her, he seemed very disappointed and even a little agitated. The two went out on his boat where everything was fine until they got to the Gulf of Mexico, where out of nowhere Dave began to make sexual advances onto Judy, which she declined. However, he suddenly became very threatening and told her he would throw her overboard if she didn't cooperate with him. He then assaulted her before returning her to the dock, something that Judy believes he only did due to the fact her friend was waiting back on land for her. The description Judy gave of the boat sounded like it could be a match for what Joan had written on the piece of paper. She also worked with a police sketch artist to come up with a drawing of Dave. Unfortunately, though, this drawing and the handwriting sample were basically the best they could do for the first several years of the investigation. And by the 3-year anniversary of the killings in May of 1992, it seemed like this unimaginably brutal crime was headed for the cold case files. In the spring of 1992, police were no closer to solving the heinous killings than they had been several years earlier when they first got the tip from Judy. A blitz of nationwide news coverage, including a feature in the show Unsolved Mysteries, had brought a ton of attention to the case and resulted in thousands of leads, all of which went nowhere. The investigative team was reshuffled in 1991 with a hope that new detectives could maybe bring a fresh set of eyes to the case and would notice something their colleagues had missed. However, for the first year, this hadn't brought any breaks to the case. In their frustration, police decided thinking outside of the box might work best. They had already been circulating the composite sketch of Judy's attacker for several years now, but the handwriting sample still hadn't been released. They wondered if perhaps someone might recognize the suspect's handwriting. They took out several billboard ads, which was a first for a police department at the time, and displayed both the composite sketch as well as the handwriting sample. The hope was, since they believed the suspect worked as a contractor, that someone would be able to recognize the handwriting. It was frankly a complete Hail Mary play, but it worked almost immediately. Not even 24 hours after the billboards had gone up, police received a tip from a man who'd hired a contractor to do some siding on his house. When he was driving home and saw the sign, he felt like the handwriting looked similar to a work order the contractor had filled out for him. He just so happened to still have that work order, and when he looked at the handwriting, he was sure it was a match. The contractor was a man by the name of Oba Chandler. Chandler had lived in the Tampa area for several years, but had recently moved his family to Daytona. He looked very similar to the composite sketch and had a lengthy criminal history which included robbery and kidnapping. More importantly, he had a boat which matched the description Joan had written down. Making matters worse for Chandler, police were also able to match a palm print found on the piece of paper with the mystery handwriting to him. Chandler admitted that he did see the 3 women on the day of their disappearance, but claimed he just gave them directions and then never saw them again afterwards. He said on the night of the murders, he was out alone on his boat and had gotten stuck out there due to an engine malfunction, which he needed to spend the whole night repairing. However, this was contradicted by people he worked with, who instead claimed Chandler told them he had, quote, spent a night on the water with 3 girlfriends. Additionally, Chandler's own family stated that he privately confessed to them he'd killed 3 women in Tampa, which was the reason they had moved to Daytona in the first place. When Oba Chandler was picked out of a lineup by Judy Blair as the mysterious Dave who'd assaulted her, he was placed under arrest and charged with the murder of the Rogers family as well as the attack on Blair. Police believe that because Chandler was from Ohio, it made Joan Rogers feel safe when he approached her and her daughters the morning of the 29th. They believed Joan had gotten lost while she was driving home from Orlando and decided to have one final impromptu night in Florida. Tragically, the person they just so happened to stop and ask for directions ended up being a monster. When he offered Joan the opportunity to take her daughters out on a boat tour of the bay, she accepted. Police believe the three women arrived at their hotel room, checked in, unpacked, had dinner, then hurried off to meet Chandler at the dock. When they got on his boat and went out to the sea, police believe Chandler pulled out a weapon on all three before forcing himself on them. One can only imagine the pain and fear that was going through their minds at the time. And it's utterly heartbreaking to think that Michelle, who had gone on this trip entirely to escape the horrors of the sexual abuse she faced at home, was now going to suffer it again. Tragically, Michelle fought to the very end, even freeing one of her hands from its binds before succumbing to the water. At his trial, Chandler denied all wrongdoing and claimed that he was being framed simply for giving the women directions. But the evidence and his criminal history painted a much different image. The image of a heartless predator out to hurt women for his own amusement. And let's be real here, when your own children are showing up at your trial as witnesses for the prosecution, things aren't going well for you. Chandler was found guilty in 1994 and sentenced to death. He filed several motions for appeal, none of which made it anywhere, and ultimately would die by lethal injection on November 15, 2011. Investigators believe these weren't the only murders Chandler committed, and 3 years after his death, linked him to the killing of a 20-year-old woman named Ivelisse Barrios Bergeris in November of 1990. However, to this day, they believe there are other cases he is also involved in and encourage the public to send any information they might have. As of 2011, Hal Rogers still lived in Ohio and still worked on the family farm. He declined to attend Oba Chandler's execution, telling reporters that he simply had no interest in seeing it and that he planned on spending that evening at home with his dogs. I think I speak for all of us when I say I hope wherever he is today, he has found some sort of peace. Thanks as always for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.